Hi, my name's Maricel. On my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, they raised their glasses, smiled, and told me the best gift I could give them was leaving the family. Then my father leaned in and said I was nothing but a useless leech. I didn't argue. I just walked out, quietly. What they didn't know was that silence can be sharper than any scream. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Because by the end of this story, you'll want to decide, if your own parents treated you this way, what would you have done? The house smelled of rosemary and lemon butter, the way it always did when I wanted things to feel like love. I'd been on my feet all day, carefully roasting the salmon the way Mom once taught me when I was still young enough to think it might earn me her smile. I'd set the table with her favorite linen, the old floral cloth, the one frayed around the edges she always teased me for keeping. Tonight was supposed to be different. Not perfect, not warm, but maybe quieter. By 6 o'clock, the living room filled with polite laughter, the kind that sounded rehearsed more than real. Dad, Carmichael, stood taller than usual in his pressed blazer. Mom, Vespera, glowed in that careful way she did at every party, as though the spotlight belonged to her even in our suburban Charleston dining room. Around the table sat Cousin Lori, two of their longtime neighbors, and Mom's bridge partner, June. I slid between them with plates, offering smiles like bandages. For a while, I convinced myself it might go smoothly. I poured wine, answered the occasional polite question, and ignored the quick glances passed across the table. Lori smiled kindly at me, though even she didn't stop the way June leaned in too far to whisper something that made Mom chuckle under her breath. I felt the old sting creep up, but I swallowed it. This was their night. When Dad raised his glass, I held my breath. 40 years, he said, voice booming enough to hush the small clatter of forks. Not everyone makes it this far. We've weathered storms, raised a family, and built a life worth celebrating. His words should have comforted me. Instead, the way he glanced sideways toward me told me I was about to regret standing there at all. Mom lifted her glass next, her smile tight as a thread pulled too far. To aging gracefully, she said, and to finally living without the kind of baggage that drags you down. Her eyes landed square on me. My chest tightened. The laughter faded into an uneasy silence. Dad leaned in, voice colder now. The truth is, Maricel, he said, the best gift you could give us tonight is leaving. You're just a useless leech clinging to this family. For a moment, the clink of glasses froze in the air. Lori's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. June cleared her throat softly. The neighbors stared into their wine, pretending not to hear. I felt every drop of blood drain from my face, but I forced a small smile that didn't belong to me. I didn't say a word. Instead, I set my napkin gently on the table. Excuse me, I said, my voice steady, though my hands trembled. Chairs creaked as heads turned, but I didn't meet their eyes. I walked slowly to the kitchen, my footsteps softer than the pounding in my chest. At the sink, I turned on the cold water and held my hands beneath it until the chill numbed my fingers. My reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger, silent, detached, but standing. I took my coat from the hook by the back door, sliding it on as though I'd practiced this moment for years. The laughter and voices behind me blurred into nothing. As the back door clicked shut, the cool night air wrapped around me. I pulled the coat tighter and kept walking, down the narrow stone path lit only by the porch light fading behind me. My throat burned, but I didn't cry. Not yet. Inside my mind, a whisper pressed forward, calm and certain. Maybe silence is stronger than screaming. I didn't look back. I didn't go back that night. Instead, I sat in my own kitchen, lights off, the clock ticking so loud it felt like it was mocking me. Sleep never came. I just stared at the chipped tiles on the counter, trying to count how many years I'd played the fool in that house. By dawn, the silence in my little home felt heavier than the insults I'd left behind. I shuffled to the kettle, filled it, and waited for the water to boil. The steam rose, curling against the morning chill, but when I poured the tea, my hands wouldn't lift the cup. My stomach twisted, too knotted to accept comfort. I told myself to get busy, to focus on something practical. Maybe that would quiet the echo of Mom's words, baggage. I opened the filing drawer in the hallway, thinking I'd sort through some paperwork. The moment I pulled out the folder, unease crept up my spine. The numbers on the bank statements didn't line up. At first, I thought I was reading them wrong. But page after page showed the same steady trickle of money leaving my account, amounts just small enough to avoid suspicion. But together, it was a river. Withdrawals I hadn't made, checks I didn't remember signing. I sat back hard in the chair, the folder spread open like a wound. My father's voice came back to me. "Let me handle the accounts, Maricel. You'll only stress yourself." He'd said it with that practiced calm that always made me feel like a child who needed his guidance. And Mom? She'd smiled and added, "We're in this together, honey. Don't worry yourself." Together. The word burned. I stood, pacing the length of the small kitchen, my mind digging up every odd moment I'd brushed aside. The emergency cash that had disappeared from Dad's old desk after he passed it down to me. Mom insisting the kitchen needed updating, tiles I never wanted, ordered and paid for without my consent. The mocking tilt of Dad's head when I once suggested starting a savings account for myself. My eyes fell on the notepad by the phone. A faint indentation on the top sheet caught my attention. I lifted it, squinting in the morning light. My own passwords, written in my handwriting, except the page beneath showed faint copies, as though someone had pressed hard enough to trace them. I pressed my hand flat against the counter. Mom. She had been in here, using this pad. Probably while smiling sweetly, pretending to call the decorator or order groceries. My throat went dry. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They had been siphoning off my life little by little, and I had let them. For a long moment, I stood frozen. Then, carefully, I gathered the statements, the notepad, and a pen. I started highlighting every suspicious entry, my hands steadier than I expected. If they thought I'd stay their quiet little scapegoat, they were wrong. But I didn't storm over there. Not yet. I knew better than to fight them on their turf, with no proof. I would need every detail, every piece of evidence. I would need to be ready. By the time the morning sun slanted across the floor, the kitchen table was covered in papers marked with bright yellow streaks. Betrayal had a paper trail, and I was finally following it. Still, part of me wanted to laugh. They'd called me a leech while living off me the whole time. The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the quiet street. And that's when I heard the flap of the mailbox outside. The mail truck was already pulling away. I almost didn't check it. But something tugged at me. Out there, nestled among bills and flyers, was an envelope with my name in handwriting I recognized. My stomach dropped before I even tore it open. The envelope was plain, no return address, just my name written in a slanted hand I knew too well. The afternoon sun stretched across the porch, catching the edge of the paper, and I stood there longer than I meant to, my fingers brushing the flap like it might burn me. Eloria. She'd lived 2 doors down for as long as I could remember, a woman in her late 70s who never missed a morning in her garden. She'd always been kind in the way that didn't draw attention, just a nod when I walked past, a smile when I brought in her newspaper during storms. I couldn't remember the last time we'd really spoken, but the moment I saw her handwriting, something inside me softened. I carried the envelope into the kitchen, the house still quiet except for the creak of the floorboards under my steps. I sat at the table, the same one I'd cluttered yesterday with bank statements and highlighted betrayals, and opened the flap with hands that didn't feel steady. Her words were simple, written in looping cursive. "I've seen what you carry, the way you shrink to make space for others. You are not invisible, and you are not wrong." I read it once, then again, and a third time. My throat tightened, but no tears fell. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. For years, I'd told myself I imagined the way people looked through me, that maybe I wasn't doing enough, giving enough, being enough. Yet here was someone who had been watching quietly, who'd noticed what even my own parents refused to see. I pressed the paper against my chest, and a memory broke through. I was 26, sitting outside a graduate seminar, clutching the withdrawal forms in my hand. Mom had called the night before, crying after Vera's accident. "You can't abandon us now, Maricel. We need you here." My professor had looked at me that morning with disappointment sharp enough to cut. "You have potential, Maricel," he'd said softly. "Don't let it go." But I had. I'd told myself it was temporary, just until things at home settled. They never did. One choice led to another, and soon I wasn't chasing my own future anymore. I was holding up everyone else's. I stared at Eloria's letter until the lines blurred. The words didn't erase the past, but for the first time, I felt like I wasn't insane for wanting more. The afternoon stretched into evening. I moved slowly, cooking a small meal I barely touched, the letter resting beside me on the counter like a silent companion. Every so often, I'd glance at it and whisper under my breath, "Not invisible." When night fell, I opened my old journal, the one I hadn't touched in years. Pages of scribbles and half-finished thoughts stared back. I slipped Eloria's letter inside, tucking it next to a torn-out sheet I'd written during one of my darkest nights. "I have been edited out of my own life." The words had haunted me then. But now, with the letter pressed against them, they felt less like a sentence and more like a warning. I didn't have to keep living this way. I closed the journal carefully, sliding it into the drawer of my nightstand. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I let myself breathe for the first time in days. I wasn't ready to confront Mom and Dad yet. Not tomorrow. Not while I was still shaking. But I knew one thing. I was done letting them define me. As I turned off the lamp, I whispered into the dark. The next morning I picked up the phone with hands that trembled more from anticipation than fear. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Tomas Reyes, an attorney in town. His tone was calm, steady, the kind you instinctively trusted. By 9:30 I was sitting in his office, staring at a wall of shelves filled with books whose spines smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The room was small, but not cramped. Warm light filtered through slatted blinds, brushing across a desk that bore the careful neatness of a man who liked order. Tomas looked at me without judgment, only quiet attention, the kind I wasn't used to receiving. "You don't need a war," he said gently, after I'd laid out a pile of statements and insurance forms. "You need a boundary that holds." The phrase lingered in the air. Boundaries. Something I'd never been allowed. He spread the documents across the desk, his finger tracing lines of numbers that made my stomach twist. "These withdrawals," he said softly, "are consistent. Same intervals. Whoever's doing it has been careful not to raise alarms." I felt my cheeks heat, a mixture of shame and anger. "I should have seen it sooner." Tomas shook his head. "You trusted the people closest to you. That's not a weakness. It's what they exploited." We reviewed the joint accounts, the deed to the house, even my insurance paperwork. He explained step by step how to freeze accounts, how to create a new will, how to set limits no one could cross without my consent. When he slid the first form toward me, pen resting neatly on top, my chest tightened. Signing meant I couldn't go back. It meant choosing myself, maybe for the first time in my life. I hesitated, staring at my name printed at the top of the page. Then, slowly, I picked up the pen. My hand was steady as I signed. Relief washed through me, not loud or triumphant, but quiet and solid, like the earth beneath my feet. On the drive home, the sky pressed low and heavy, clouds swelling with the threat of rain. I rolled down the window just enough to feel the damp air, as though the world was carrying part of the weight with me. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the curtains in my parents' living room shift, watching, waiting. I went inside without knocking. By mid-afternoon, a soft knock came at my bedroom door. "Maricel," Mom's voice floated through, sugary sweet. I opened the door just enough to see her holding a tray with 2 slices of burnt toast and a mug of tea so dark it looked like tar. Her smile was practiced. "Thought you could use a little comfort. We don't need to dwell on the other night. I'd had a bit too much wine, that's all. You know me, I joke when I shouldn't." Her words cut sharper than the insult itself, as if rewriting the moment would make it vanish. I looked at her, really looked, and realized how many times I'd let her smooth over cruelty with charm. I didn't argue. Instead, I took a slow breath and said, "You called me a leech, Mom. That wasn't a joke." Her expression flickered, but she recovered quickly, pressing a laugh. "Oh, come on! Don't take everything so seriously." This time, I didn't bite. I didn't defend myself. I simply closed the door, gently but firmly, the click of the latch louder than any scream. That night, I sat at my desk with the journal open in front of me. I slipped today's signed form inside, next to Ilaria's letter. The ink from my pen bled into the page as I wrote, "This isn't revenge. It's air." For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Boundaries don't stay hidden for long. By the next evening, the storm arrived, not outside just yet, though the sky was turning gray, but through the relentless buzz of my phone. It started with a voicemail from my cousin Rachel. Her voice was syrupy but sharp around the edges. "Your mom said you're freezing her out. That's cruel, Maricel. She's been nothing but good to you. You need to answer her." I stared at the phone, my thumb hovering but never pressing play again. A few minutes later, another message came through, this time from a number I recognized from church but hadn't spoken to in months. The voice was polite, almost cheerful, but I could hear the undertone. "Just checking in. Heard some worrying things. Hope you're not shutting your family out." By the time the third message rolled in, I didn't even need to check the caller ID. It was my cousin Lori. Her text read, "I can't believe you'd do this after everything she's done for you. Are you really this ungrateful?" Ungrateful. The word cut deep, sharper than the toast on the anniversary night. They had all turned the story on its head, painting me as the villain for daring to stand up. Downstairs, the kitchen erupted in noise. Cabinet doors slammed hard enough to rattle the glasses. I could hear Mom's heavy footsteps pacing back and forth, the deliberate creak of the floorboards, as though to remind me she was there, that she wasn't going anywhere. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone buzzing on the nightstand, and pulled my journal into my lap. The pen felt heavier than usual, but I pressed it to the paper anyway. I am not punishing her. I am reclaiming what is mine. The more I wrote, the louder the house seemed to grow. The clatter of pots, the exaggerated sighs, the shuffle of her shoes dragging across the tile. It was a performance, one she had perfected over the years. An orchestra of guilt. Another text lit up my phone. "Selfish. You'll regret this." A no name, but I knew the tone. It had my mother's fingerprints all over it. I locked my bedroom door for the first time in my life, not because I thought she'd hurt me physically, though the thought had crossed my mind, but because I needed a boundary she could see, hear, and feel. The click of that lock was like a line in the sand, a whisper that said, "You don't get to come in anymore." I leaned back against the door, listening as the storm outside finally broke. Rain hammered the windows, wind howling against the siding. The noise drowned out her pacing below, blending her fury with nature's own. For the first time, I didn't feel cornered. I felt steady. Still, the weight of it pressed down, neighbors whispering, cousins judging, even friends I thought neutral sending messages laced with passive concern. I had become the family pariah overnight, the story already twisted and passed around like a cautionary tale. And yet, in that quiet space with the rain against the glass and the lock firm beneath my hand, I realized something. Silence could be its own shield. I didn't respond to a single message. I didn't go downstairs. I simply wrote until my hand cramped, filling page after page, the ink bleeding truths I'd buried for too long. The storm raged on outside, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew there was more coming. I could feel it in my bones. But for that night, I had drawn a line they couldn't erase. I thought I was ready for the whispers, the sideways glances, the thinly veiled texts. But nothing prepared me for what I saw when the bank manager slid those papers across the desk. The morning after the phone storm, I drove to the bank in silence. Rain had stopped during the night, leaving the streets slick and shining, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. I parked farther away than usual, giving myself an extra walk to steady my nerves. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and paper, the hum of fluorescent lights pressing down on the stillness. Mr. Dalton, the branch manager, greeted me with the polite warmth I'd always known him for, but as soon as he sat behind his desk and began typing into the computer, that warmth shifted into something else, a kind of careful seriousness. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and finally looked me in the eye. "Maricel," he said, tapping the papers, "someone's been transferring small amounts regularly, nothing big at a time, but it adds up. Over $6,000 in the last year alone." The room felt suddenly colder. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression calm. I didn't need him to say who. I already knew. "Can you show me where it went?" My voice surprised me. Steady, not trembling like I felt inside. He nodded, turning the page so I could see the destination account. I recognized the last 4 digits, the same joint account my mother had once insisted on, for convenience. Her convenience. I thanked him, tucked the printouts into my folder, and walked out into the weak sunlight. My shoes clicked against the pavement, each step louder than the last. For years, I had told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was careless. But there it was, proof, in black and white. That evening, the house was unusually quiet when I came in. Mom was in the living room, folding laundry into neat stacks, her eyes darting up when she saw me with the folder under my arm. She smiled tightly, as though she had been expecting me. "I saw the withdrawals," I said simply. My tone was calm, but every word carried the weight of what I had just uncovered. Her hands froze mid-fold before she dropped the towel back into the basket. "You're overreacting," she snapped, too quickly. "It was for things we needed. Groceries, the new water heater, little things here and there. You always said we're in this together. God, Maricel, you're being selfish." The word again. Selfish. It rolled off her tongue like a weapon polished from years of use. I repeated softly, almost like tasting it for the first time. "Selfish?" Then I turned, leaving her standing there, the basket of laundry still half folded. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and turned the lock, firm, deliberate, not out of fear, but refusal. I sat down at my desk, opened my journal, and let the pen move. They steal and still call me selfish, but this silence is my answer. The sound of her moving downstairs grew distant, drowned out by the scratching of my pen. For the first time, I didn't feel cornered by her accusations. The evidence was mine, and so was the silence I chose. I slipped the bank statements into the journal's back pocket, pressed my hand against the closed cover, and breathed in deeply. Tomorrow would bring more storms. I knew that much. But tonight, I had drawn another line. The next morning, when I opened the mailbox, the air was cool and damp, the kind that still carries a trace of last night's rain. The little red flag clinked softly as I lowered it, and there it was, another plain envelope, my name written in neat, familiar handwriting. No return address. I didn't even wait until I was inside. Standing right there on the porch, I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a folded page. My breath caught when I saw the signature at the bottom, Eloria Darnell. She'd lived 2 doors down since I was a child. The woman who always waved from her rocking chair, who lent me sugar once when Mom pretended we didn't have any. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate. I've watched for years, not to intrude, but to bear witness. I've seen what you give, the way you disappear to make others more comfortable. You are not invisible, and you are not wrong. I had to sit. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I lowered myself, letter trembling in my hands. My chest tightened, not with fear this time, but something rare, recognition. Tears pressed at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked hard, refusing to let them fall onto the ink. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone had seen me. Without me explaining, without me begging. I read it again, slower, letting each word settle deep inside. My whole life, I'd been told I was too sensitive, too selfish, too much, or not enough. Yet here was a neighbor, quiet, observant, telling me the opposite. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. I carried the letter inside like it was fragile glass and tucked it into my journal, right beside the torn page where I had once written in desperation, "I have been edited out of my own life." Seeing the two side by side made something shift in me, like pieces finally clicking together. By evening, I decided to do something small, something that seemed ordinary to anyone else but felt monumental to me. I cooked just for myself. Nothing fancy. Grilled chicken, green beans, a baked potato. I set the table for one. And for the first time in years, I pulled out the embroidered napkin my mother had mocked when I was younger, saying it was too precious for every day. I laid it out carefully, smoothed the wrinkles with my hand, and sat down. The sound of my fork scraping against the plate felt almost ceremonial, a private declaration that I belonged at this table too. Downstairs, I could hear her, my mother, pacing harder, opening and slamming drawers like punctuation marks in some silent argument. She wanted me to come out, to play the role I always had, but I didn't. I didn't rush in to soothe her, to apologize for breathing too loudly, to fix whatever invisible offense she'd decided I'd committed. Instead, I ate slowly, savoring every bite, the napkin on my lap like a shield. When I finished, I washed the dishes, dried my hands, and returned to my journal. I wrote, "This isn't cruelty. This is return." The house creaked with her restless movements, but I felt steady. The storm of manipulation that had raged through calls and texts yesterday couldn't drown out the truth written in Eloria's gentle script. I wasn't alone. I had been seen, and for the first time, that was enough. By the end of that week, the knock on my door was sharp but not rushed. When I opened it, a courier stood there, his raincoat dotted with heavy drops, a sealed envelope in his hand. The sky behind him was a sheet of gray, the kind that threatened an all-day storm. "Delivery for Maricel Hanlon," he said. My fingers trembled as I signed, not from fear but from the weight of knowing what this envelope carried. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment before tearing it open. Inside was the notarized confirmation. The deed was now in my name alone, the accounts frozen and secured. It was done. Legally irreversible. The relief didn't come as a rush but as a slow exhale, like I'd been holding my breath for years. It didn't take long for the house to react. Vespera's fist pounded against my bedroom door not 20 minutes later. "You've made your point, Maricel. Now undo it." Her voice was sharp, rehearsed in the way only someone who thought they still held control could deliver. I stood, smoothing my sweater as though I had all the time in the world, and opened the door just enough for her eyes to meet mine. "It's not a game, Vespera," I said quietly. "There's nothing to undo." Her jaw tightened. She leaned closer, lowering her voice into something between a hiss and a plea. "You'll regret this." For a moment, I almost laughed at the predictability of it. Instead, I answered softly, "Maybe. But at least this regret will be mine." Then I shut the door, firm enough that the latch clicked like punctuation. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows. Inside, the silence that followed her retreat was louder than her fists had been. 2 days later, before the sun had fully lifted, I woke to the sound of luggage scraping across the hardwood floor. I didn't move, just listened. The thud of drawers being slammed shut, the muffled curses under Carmichael's breath, the shuffle of coats being yanked from the closet. When the front door finally closed, it wasn't a slam. It was worse. A quiet pull, followed by a pause, then the click of it latching. I went downstairs after the silence stretched too long. They were gone. The living room looked half erased, a few picture frames missing, some drawers left open, a lamp cord dangling where the base had been taken. But the house didn't feel violated. Not anymore. It felt empty in a way that gave me space. I walked into the living room and set the flower painting, my grandmother's, that Vespera had hidden behind the couch years ago back onto the wall. Then I replaced the harsh white bulbs with warm light. Finally, I draped my grandmother's quilt, the one my mother had once sneered at for being too shabby, across the couch. The rain eased to a steady patter as I opened every window, one by one, letting the damp storm air sweep through. Curtains billowed, and the house seemed to sigh with me, exhaling the years of mockery, control, and small thefts of dignity. For the first time, the silence wasn't punishment, it was freedom. I walked back to my journal, sat with the weight of the quilt still on my shoulders, and wrote, "The final break doesn't feel like breaking at all. It feels like air." I thought the silence would break me. But then, in the quiet, I heard something new. My own life. The morning sun filtered through the curtains in a way I hadn't seen in years, casting a soft golden glow over the living room walls. After days of heavy rain, the air felt washed clean, as if the house itself had been waiting for this light. I slipped on my boots and carried a tray of lavender and sage seedlings out to the garden. The soil was damp and forgiving, and I pressed each seedling into place with care. With every handful of earth, I felt like I was anchoring myself, rooting my future into the ground I now knew was truly mine. As I knelt by the flower bed, I heard the sound of small footsteps on the walkway. I looked up to see the Henderson girls, no older than 10, carrying a little wicker basket. One of them smiled shyly. "Mom baked muffins," the taller one said, holding the basket out. "She says your garden makes her feel brave." For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. My throat tightened, not with hurt this time, but with a strange, quiet gratitude. "Tell your mom thank you," I finally managed, accepting the basket. "That means more than you know." The girls grinned and hurried off, their laughter trailing down the sidewalk. I sat back on my heels, letting the warmth of their kindness seep into me. Recognition didn't always come from where you expected, but sometimes it arrived exactly when you needed it. That evening, I set the table for one. No pretense, no waiting for anyone else. Just me. I placed a single candle in the center and unfolded the old embroidered napkin. Yes, the same one Vespera had once mocked as old-fashioned and useless. I smoothed it gently on the table, smiling at how right it looked there. It wasn't just a piece of fabric anymore. It was proof that I could choose what stayed in my life. I opened my journal and wrote, "I thought disappearing would break me, but maybe I was never meant to be seen by them. Maybe I was meant to see myself." As the candle flickered, the phone rang. its sound cutting through the quiet. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before I picked up. Maricel? Vespera's voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Frail, uncertain. The house doesn't feel right without you. I sat back, the napkin under my palm grounding me. My voice was calm, steady. I can't go back to being small so you can feel big. There was silence on the other end. No rebuttal, no excuse. Just breathing. I let the pause stretch, then hung up softly. No anger, no triumph. Just peace. Later, I carried a cup of tea out to the porch. The candle still glowed inside, and the embroidered napkin rested folded by my journal. Children's laughter drifted faintly from down the block, carried on the breeze. I leaned back in my chair, inhaling the scent of lavender from the garden. The silence that had once felt like punishment now wrapped around me like a blanket. It was no longer emptiness. It was freedom. I smiled to myself, closing my eyes as the sunlight warmed my face. Maybe the best gift was never leaving them. It was finally coming home to myself.